Well, hello there, friends. Welcome to the Monday edition of A Daily Walk. Here we are in the middle of June, starting another week. I hope that your Monday is starting off well. As I often say, there's no better way to start the day, start a week, than in the Word and in prayer. And it makes all the difference. You know, I've noticed through the years that if you don't have start with a healthy, solid spiritual breakfast, well, it can affect you throughout the day. But what a difference the Word of God makes. And I pray that you're seeing that as we go through the Word together daily, walking it out with the Lord. Well, we find ourselves now still in 1 Corinthians. We are in the 9th chapter, and the Apostle Paul has been talking about his ministry, some of the practices that he had put into place, which had a lot to do with self-sacrifice. You know, if you want to be a servant, if you want to serve other people, there is a requirement of putting others before yourself. And that isn't always the natural inclination for most of us, but it certainly is the example that we're given by Jesus. And Paul certainly modeled this as well. So we pick up today, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, looking at the 19th verse. Paul writes, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more." Paul, earlier in this epistle, said, if you're going to consider us, when you're thinking about us, think about us as stewards and servants of the Lord. That is our purpose. We are here to serve God. And Paul said, although I'm a free man, I've actually made the choice to be a servant to everybody. And Jesus said, you remember, the greatest in the kingdom is the servant of all. Jesus had said to his disciples, I've left you an example that you should follow, to be a servant. And Paul goes on to describe the reason why he has made himself a servant is in order that he might win people to Christ. And there were different groups that Paul ministered to. And therefore, he would adapt his ministry to the culture and or the people that he was surrounded by. Notice what he says in verse 20. And to the Jews, I became a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. The first group that Paul adapted his ministry to, and it wouldn't be very difficult because Paul himself was a Jew, and more than that, he was a Pharisee. And therefore, when Paul was on his missionary journeys, typically the first place that he would stop would be a synagogue. A synagogue, of course, was a place for the Jewish people to gather, where they would read from the scriptures and they would expound upon the scriptures. So Paul would typically make his stop there, go into the synagogue, be given the opportunity to read from a particular scroll, and he would expound upon the word of God. And his intention was to prove to all of the Jews that were gathered there that Jesus was the Messiah. And so he would pull from Old Testament passages and he would tie them into the work and the ministry of Jesus. And in those cases, some people believed, other people rejected it. But when Paul was among the Jewish people, he knew how to speak to them, speak their language, and use the scriptures in order to point them to Jesus. He adapted his ministry to that particular group. He also adds to those who are under the law. I will be under the law. There were those Jews, then there were the strict ones that really sought to hold to the 613 commandments. And Paul knew what that was like because he had attempted to gain righteousness. He writes about it in Philippians, this righteousness that he tried to attain by keeping all of the commandments, being under the law. He knew what it was to try to live that way. And so he was able to minister to those people. Knowing what their mentality was, he would be able to minister to them from that vantage point, again, in order to bring them to Christ. He made himself a servant to all people. But that wasn't the only group of people that Paul ministered to. He was also called to minister to the Gentiles. And he picks that up right here when he says, verse 21, to those who are without the law. Of course, this would be a reference to the Gentiles. as without the law. Not being without the law toward God, I mean, just to be clear, he says, but under the law toward Christ. And what is the purpose? He tells us, that I might win those who are without the law. What is the goal? What is the emphasis of adapting his ministry in certain places? I want to win them to Christ. And therefore, to the Jewish person, I'm gonna reason and preach and teach, knowing what their background is, how they're entwined in the law. I'm gonna meet them where they're at. Why? Because I want to win them to Jesus. To the Gentiles, I'm not going to come with the law. I'm not going to come with the dietary. I mean, they don't know anything about that. That's not the point. Paul said, I'm to the Gentiles, to those without the law, I'm going to preach to them. Those that are surrounded by this Hellenistic culture, that's what I'm going to do. And you know what's interesting? You do find Paul doing that. You know, if you go to the book of Acts, when Paul eventually made his way into Athens, he was there at a place called Mars Hill. I've actually been there myself and been on that spot where Paul preached and preached from the scriptures what Paul preached that day. See, there in Athens, they had idols all around them. They're everywhere. In fact, there are many remnants of those idols today and statues everywhere when you're in Greece. But when Paul was there, as he walked through the city, he noticed that there was one particular altar, one particular place of worship that was dedicated to the unknown God. I mean, they worshiped all kinds of gods, but then these Gentiles, being without the law, being without the one true God, had one God just in case we missed one. This is just to cover all of our bases. And Paul said to these Gentiles who were without the law, I want to talk to you about this unknown God. And he began to describe the God of the Bible. And as he was preaching to them, he also quoted some of their philosophers and tied it in to what he was preaching on in order to bring them to Christ. Paul was aware of what was going on in the culture. Paul was aware of what the Hellenists were believing and drawn to. And so he used all of that to appeal to those who were without the law for the sole purpose of winning them to Christ. Folks, I think it is important, if I may say, in light of Paul's message here in the 9th chapter, that we know our audience. Who are we speaking to? Sometimes as Christians, we speak Christianese. And by that, I mean, we have all of these terms that as Christians, we're very familiar with. But a non-believer, they don't know what that's about. They don't know about redemption, justification, sanctification, soteriology, etc., eschatology. Like, what are you even talking about? So we need to be able to speak in a way that they understand, to build a bridge in conversation and bring the cross to them. Know your audience. Who are you surrounded by? What is their background? What is it's good to be well versed in some of these things. Even some of the false religions of the world today. What do they believe and why do they believe it? And I can understand what they're saying and I can come from that perspective in order to win them. Well, may God help us today on this Monday to adapt, to be a blessing, to be all things to all people. God bless you. We'll see you tomorrow.